There are lists that kill, lists of names that echo inside prison walls, lists typed by shaking hands during wartime trials, lists made by men who thought they were Godspit. What if there was a list that never needed names at all, a list that existed only in the shadows of the mind, a system not written, but sensed in the early years of the Third Reich, before the tanks rolled, before the screams filled basements, and before the resistance had a name? There was a method, quiet, invisible, yet precise. Reich did not rely on surveillance cameras. There were no microphones hidden in walls, no digital trails to follow, and yet it could find the threat before the threat even spoke, before he printed a pamphlet, before she wrote a line of defiance in her diary. You see, Adolf Hitler did not wait for rebellion, he anticipated it. And the way he did it was not with a rifle, but with something far colder, a psychological formula, an unspoken algorithm designed to read minds through posture, through hesitation, through the angle of the eyes when someone lied, or worse, when they thought for themselves. This system was never officially documented. It was passed in murmurs between psychological advisors, through coded conversations in the corridors of power, and the few who knew it did not survive long enough to tell the full tale. Fragments remain in classified letters, in the sudden disappearance of philosophers, in the strange way a man's life could vanish, not after committing a crime, but after thinking. Only, and the question is, did it work? Can a government predict a traitor before he becomes only, and if so, can that same tactic still exist behind newer regimes, with newer tools? Would you know if your thoughts had already betrayed? Yodel us in the comments. Can belief alone make someone dangerous? He arrived without a folder, no background check, no criminal record, not even a school certificate followed him. And yet, within 10 minutes of stepping into the Reich's intelligence bureau, he was marked. His name was Ernst Bauer. He was a math teacher, 43 years old, lived alone, no political ties, never published a paper, the kind of man who blended into the wallpaper of history. But that day, he blinked twice when he saw the portrait of Hitler in the hallway. His shoulders flinched at the sound of marching boots. He hesitated before shaking the officer's hand, and someone noticed. Not a general, not a spy, but a man sitting silently in the corner. He was not dressed in uniform. He did not wear a badge. He carried no weapon, only a notebook. His name never appeared on any official roster, but he had a role, a very specific role. To watch, to listen, to sense. He belonged to a hidden branch within the Third Reich, not military, not Gestapo, but something older, stranger, born from the ideas of early behaviorists, hypnotists, and philosophers who believed the mind could be measured, even predicted. And he made a small mark in his notebook beside Ernst's name. Not guilty, not disloyal, just potential. You see, in the early years of the regime, the Nazi government had a problem. Not everyone who posed a threat was shouting on street corners. Some were whispering behind closed doors. Some were thinking in ways that could someday lead to dissent. But how do you wrest a thought? How do you eliminate a future threat without proof? You build a system, one that does not rely on evidence, but on patterns. And it begins with silence, with subtlety, with people like the man, with no files. Ernst Bauer never knew he had been observed. After the interview, he was told his teaching license would be delayed. Then, 2 weeks later, revoked. No reason given, no letter, no hearing. He went home confused, and within 3 months, he was gone. Some say he moved to Austria. Others claim he jumped into the Danube. But those are stories. The truth, his mind, had been flagged, not for what he did, but for what he might one day believe. So how did they know? How could a stranger, watching for 10 minutes, predict danger? It began with a theory, one stolen from a Russian psychologist in 1913, a theory that said, before a man speaks treason, his eyes ask permission, and the Reich built on that. They created a list, not of names but of facial tics, voice cracks, breathing patterns, and eye movements under stress. This was mental profiling before computers existed, an algorithm made of human instinct refined through interrogations, laboratory interviews, and pages of handwritten symbols. If a man clenched his jaw when asked about loyalty, if his pupils dilated when the Fuhrer was mentioned, if his left hand twitched during the anthem was marked, Even if he never spoke a word, even if he waved the flag, even if he wept at Rallyesh, could be erased. And so the list grew, invisible, unwritten. But dead Libby 1937, over 12,000 individuals had quietly lost jobs, homes, or families, not because of protest, but because of posture, not because of action, but because of possibility. Ernst Bauer's story was one of thousands, but he was the first known case where the system was tested and worked. He never spoke against the Reich. He never wrote a manifesto. But the list did not need evidence. It only needed a feeling, a pattern, a flicker of thought in the wrong direction, and someone, somewhere, was always watching. Let this sink in. In a regime powered by noise, marches, chants, guns, and steel, its deadliest tool was silence. A silence that could erase you before you even whispered wrong. He did not need to hear your voice. He did not need to watch you argue, march, or hold a banned book. All he needed was to notice how you looked away when the anthem played, how you sat too quietly at the back of a meeting, whether your fingers trembled slightly when a soldier passed your window. To the Reich, that was enough. It began with blank notebooks, thousands of them, shipped quietly to post offices, doctor clinics, police stations, and village schoolrooms, each one bound in black, each one stamped with a red serial number, and each one empty. But it was the instructions that mattered, not what to write, but what to see. A man who reads before sunrise, note him. A boy who questions maps, observe him. A woman who lingers too long near train tracks, document her. And no one ever told you why. This was called behavioral precaution, a phrase that never made it to the newspapers, but rewired an entire nation. It was not about catching criminals, it was about predicting the future. You see, the new Reich did not wait for rebellion, it hunted the idea of it, and the tools were invisible. Teachers were told to draw emotional graphs for their students. If a child's mood dipped twice in 1 week, they were flagged. Police were trained to mark conversations, especially those that trailed off into silence. They were told silence often meant unsaid opposition. The list was never written. It did not have names. It had patterns. Even doctors joined the system. Medical staff were quietly told to report irregular eye movement during appointments. If a patient hesitated before answering a question about the Führer, even for a second, it was written down as emotional dissent. But this was not surveillance. This was something worse. It was mental choreography, a way to train the population to move in rhythm, to think without friction, to walk in emotional sync. And those who moved differently, they became shadows, watched, isolated, slowly erased from memory. By 1936, several universities in Germany had created psychological deviation models. These were charts, full of data, showing how often someone needed solitude before they became dangerous, how long a man could stay unmarried before he might turn disloyal, whether people who listened to foreign music were more prone to philosophical unrest. It was not madness, it was method. And it had a master. No photo exists of him. No birth certificate, no death notice, but those who whispered his name in basement corridors knew him as the examiner, the ghost in the files, the man who taught the system not to punish thought, but to intercept it. He trained analysts to watch the edges of words, not their content, to feel when someone paused unnaturally, to sense when a breath was held just half a second longer than normal. He once said, "A true threat speaks long before the lips open. The body always betrays the mind." His techniques were stolen from stage magicians, courtroom interrogators, and experimental psychologists. He combined facial micro-expression mapping with early hypnosis theory. Even church confessionals were redesigned under his influence, not to collect guilt, but to detect internal resistance. The goal was simple: find those who might doubt before they realize they do. And it worked. Villages turned into laboratories. Small towns became echo chambers of fear. No one spoke freely. No one dared. Children learned to smile not because they felt joy, but because stillness brought questions. Women practiced standing postures in front of mirrors to appear emotionally neutral. Men learned to fake enthusiasm in their eyes during political speeches, because anything less might trigger a mark in the invisible files. There were no files. That was the trick. There was no formal list, no paper trail, Just a cloud of observation. Everywhere and nowhere. You could never say you were being watched, but you could feel it. In how the baker no longer greeted you. In how your daughter's name was quietly removed from the school honor board. In how your work assignment was suddenly moved to the outskirts. There was no explanation, only distance. And then, one morning, your name would not be called. Not at school, not at the factory, not at home. You would simply be forgotten. And those who remembered you, they would forget even faster. Because to remember someone who vanished meant you might be next. That was the brilliance of the list that never existed. It trained memory itself. To discard, to edit, to erase. Even history obeyed. Newspaper archives were trimmed. Photographs were retouched. Census documents quietly altered. A man who once taught philosophy in Leipzig, gone. A midwife in Frankfurt who asked too many questions, gone. A schoolboy who refused to sing the national song, gone. No cell, no trial, no accusation, just disappearance. This was not a regime of brute force. It was a regime of quiet decisions, scattered across thousands of desks, carried out by people who never thought of themselves as villains. Each one saying, I was just following the signs, but the signs were poisoned, and so was the silence. Because once silence becomes a tool of power, even your thoughts are no longer yours. Which leads us to the next descent, a chapter deeper still, where uniforms became masks, and belief became a performance. They wore belief like a badge, but inside, they were empty. They stood tall. They marched in rhythm. They shouted the words they were told to shout, but behind the uniforms, there was no fire, only rehearsal. You see, not every man in the Reich believed. Not every soldier worshipped the flag, but belief was no longer a requirement. Performance was enough. And no one performed better than the frightened. By 1938, uniform had replaced personality. A man's face no longer mattered, only how well he copied the script. In every office, every town square, every street patrol, the same mask, pride in the eyes, certainty in the voice, loyalty in the step. But it was all surface. They were puppets, not because someone pulled their strings, but because they tied their own. To survive. It began in the training halls, where new recruits were taught not just to shoot or salute, but to feel nothing. They were shown footage of families being separated, then told, this is peace being restored. They were told to watch a boy cry for his mother, then mark it as weakness. If anyone flinched, they were pulled aside, not punished, just recalibrated. With words, with repetition, with cold, practiced silence. By the end of their training, they no longer needed orders. They knew what was expected. A frown during a speech, treason. A hesitation at a checkpoint, subversion. A question about ethics. That was the biggest threat of all. So they stopped thinking, and they started copying. Every nod, every cheer, every clap, practiced like actors. In a theater where forgetting your line could mean disappearing. Some did it for safety, some did it for power. But most did it because they no longer knew who they were. And that was the point. To turn men into mirrors. To make their eyes reflect only what the Reich wanted to see. There was a word whispered in underground circles. Reflection syndrome. It meant a man so trained to mimic loyalty that he forgot his own reflection. He looked in the mirror and saw only the mask. This was not accidental. It was a strategy. Because when you make people perform long enough, they forget it is a performance. They become the role, even when alone, even in dreams. One soldier, years later, said, I used to practice my smiles in the dark, just in case someone was watching. No one ever was. But the fear was enough. And it did not stop with soldiers. It spread to teachers, to train conductors, to judges. If a judge paused too long before reading a sentence, he was watched. If a teacher changed the tone while saying the Führer's name, she was warned. If a train worker greeted someone in Yiddish, he was replaced. The message was clear. You will not be punished for wrong beliefs. You will be punished for showing them. So belief became internal camouflage. Men learned to laugh on command. Women learned to nod at every slogan. Children learned to repeat phrases they did not understand, just to stay invisible. But invisibility was fragile. One blink at the wrong time, One glance to long at a forbidden poster. One sigh when no one else sighed, and the mask would crack, and when it cracked, it was not the man who suffered. It was his family. His mother, his sister, his son. The Reich did not need evidence. It needed conformity. So the pressure spread like smoke, invisible, but choking. A culture of eyes, watching, measuring, silently recording every pause, every smile, every silence that lasted a second too long. And still, some tried to resist. Quietly. A mechanic who played band music at night. A librarian who slipped one forbidden book behind a row of approved ones. A nurse who gave comfort to a mother whose child had been taken. Tiny rebellions. But even these were noticed, not by spies, but by neighbors, by friends, by students. You see, in a world ruled by performance, everyone became part of the play, and no one wanted to be the scene partner who dragged the act down. So they reported each other, not out of hate, but out of fear, because if you did not report the weakness, you became the weakness, and so, the puppets multiplied. Strings tied to nothing, yet moving in perfect unison. Some tried to remember who they were. They wrote secret journals. They carved words into wooden floors. They whispered their real thoughts to walls, hoping the walls would forget. But even walls had ears now. And soon, the only safe thought was no thought at all. So they stared forward. They stood tall. They saluted on cue. Not because they believed, but because they could no longer afford not to. And that is how a nation becomes a stage, where fear writes the script, and silence wins the applause. But the performance cannot last forever, because behind every mask, there's still breath, still heartbeat, still memory. Waiting for the curtain to fall. And when it does, who remembers the puppets? Not the historians, not the survivors, not even the victims, because the puppets were never real. They were fragments of fear, stitched into uniform, ghosts with polished boots. Which brings us to the next descent, where speech was no longer language, and words became weapons. There was no address on the gate, no name on the door, no number carved into the stone arch above it. But among the few who dared speak of it, it was called one thing: the house with no shadows. It sat in the heart of Berlin, hidden not by distance, but by silence. No one guarded it. No soldiers stood outside. But the fear it projected reached farther than any SS checkpoint. It was not a place of blood or bullets. It was not designed to break bones. It was built to break patterns. Inside that building, Hitler's quietest war was being fought. A war against possibility. This was not the Gestapo's domain. This was not Himmler's cage. This was something far colder, something surgical. A place where the mind itself was measured for loyalty. Here, inside these walls, sat the Reich's behavioral profilers. Men and women trained in silence, in patterns, in the breath before rebellion. They studied more than words. They studied hesitation, eye movement, posture, the rhythm between a question and its answer. One of its lead architects was a man named Erich Lind. He had no rank insignia, no speeches, no photographs. But what he designed reshaped how the Third Reich hunted dissent. He believed enemies could be identified before they even knew they were enemies. Not through confession, but through prediction. Lind's office was quiet. One desk, one lamp, one wall of names. But those names were not criminals. They were not caught with evidence. They had not spoken a word against the Führer. And that is why they were dangerous. Lind had a theory. He called it Category Zero. These were individuals who had done nothing. But according to Lind's models, they would. Sooner or later, they would resist. Not because of ideology, but because their psychological rhythm leaned toward rebellion. He tracked it like an infection, a pulse, a whisper beneath the skin. To the outside world, the house seemed harmless. Visitors came under soft names: Department of Social Alignment, Bureau of National Health, Office of Thought Studies. They were offered tea, comfortable chairs, questions about their jobs, their families, their views on music, on children, on clocks. But nothing in the house was casual. The tea was a test, how much sugar they used. The chair was a test, where they chose to sit. Even the way they stirred the cup was noted, logged, and compared. Every visitor was observed by a team of analysts in the walls behind the walls. A one-way mirror disguised as a painting, cameras hidden behind air vents. Even the temperature in the room was controlled, dropped slightly during political questions, raised during personal ones. They were not interviewing people, they were weighing them. Lynn's team did not use names in their logs. They used symbols, patterns, dashes and loops that charted heartbeat responses to key phrases like duty, state, sacrifice, and truth. If a subject's pattern matched that of a previously known dissenter, they were added to the list that never existed. In late 1938, a school teacher named Greta Hoffman was called to the house. She had taught mathematics in Hamburg for nearly a decade, never missed a class, never uttered a word against the state. She even kept a portrait of Hitler in her classroom, as required. But she was flagged, not by a colleague, not by a student. By a letter she wrote to her sister. In it, she described a moment during a propaganda broadcast. She had laughed, not out of protest, but confusion, a nervous, fleeting laugh that escaped when a minister claimed that numbers could lie. But the heart never could. Lynn's team received the letter through a routine postal scan. That laugh was all it took. She was invited to Berlin under the pretense of an educational reform seminar. She was welcomed with kindness. The questions were soft, but her file was already sealed before she stepped into the building. She vanished to weeks later. No charges, no trial. Her house was quietly reassigned. Her school records amended. Her name never spoken again. Lynn's success grew. The Reich began using his methods not just for enemies, but for selection, promotions, appointments, even marriages. Potential SS officers were run through simulations that mirrored casual interviews. They were not told what was being measured, but their behavior under boredom, praise, and silence became the new standard. It was no longer about loyalty in words. It was about psychological obedience. One method in the house was called the clock test. A subject was asked to tell the time from a blank-faced clock. No hands, no numbers, just a circle. It seemed pointless, but Lynn's team watched which way the eyes moved, whether they turned clockwise, counterclockwise, or froze entirely. According to internal theory, those who invented time in reverse order were prone to reverse the order of society. Outlandish, yes, but it worked. The predictive pattern was never perfect, but it was close enough to keep Lynn funded, protected, and hidden. One day, a mid-ranking military officer named Kurt Degenhardt was brought in. His loyalty was unquestioned. Medals, commendations, 3 generations of military blood. But during the clock test, his fingers trembled. Just once. He was detained for questioning, then reassigned to administrative duties in a remote province. 3 months later, Degenhardt attempted to defect through Switzerland, shot at the border. Lynn had seen it coming, and that became the new mythology of the house. They could see the rebellion before the rebel did. But the most haunting case in the house's files was marked only by initials, FHA scholar from Leipzig. No public record, no subversive writings. A man who spent most of his life researching ancient languages. He was flagged for smiling too long at a library poster. Just a second too long. The poster featured a quote, "Obedience is the root of peace." His smile lingered, not in approval, but in irony. It was subtle, but Lynn saw ITFH was summoned, not arrested, just asked to come in. Polite letter, signature of the Cultural Review office. He walked in at 8:12 a.m. He was never seen again. What became of him? No record. But in the house's logbook, beside his symbol, someone had written, he understood the quote. That was the problem. By 1942, the house with no shadows had profiled over 31,000 people. Not all were detained. Many were simply noted. Some were quietly removed from positions of influence. Others were denied promotions. A few were offered sudden opportunities abroad. The point was not always punishment. The point was neutralization. Why wait for dissent to rise? Why let a fire burn when you can freeze the spark? Lynn vanished in the final year of the war. No body, no escape records, only a locked drawer in his office which held a single paper. On it, one sentence. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who speaks, but the one who prepares not to. That philosophy did not die with the Third Reich. Versions of it lived on, in Cold War surveillance, in intelligence models, in modern algorithms that track behavior before crime. But none spoke of the house, because the house did not exist, and neither did the list. They did not have headstones, no markers in the earth, no flowers, no family standing in silence, only gaps in classrooms, in mail routes, in dinner tables and libraries, gaps where people used to be, and no one dared ask why, because asking was a signal, and signals were watched. The victims of the list that never existed did not scream. They did not protest. Many did not even know they were being erased. That was the genius and the horror of it. This was not a war of fire. It was a war of quiet subtraction. People removed from the future without touching the present. Some were teachers. Some were scientists. Some were janitors, priests, seamstresses, violinists, cobblers, meteorologists. There was no single profile, no unifying ideology. The only common trait was that they were statistically likely to interfere. They did not interfere yet, but they might. And in Hitler's psychological playbook, that was enough. It was not just paranoia. It was mathematics, probability, logic weaponized. And behind that logic stood a machine, not made of gears, but of notebooks, instincts, and bureaucrats trained to listen for the breath. Before a sentence. In 1943, an internal report, handwritten, unsigned, and marked eyes only, circulated through a secret channel within the Reich main security office. The document listed 27 new symbols, not names, symbols. Each represented an individual who, according to the latest pattern matching protocols, posed a cognitive disruption risk. What does that mean? It means they were thinking differently, not loudly, not dangerously, just differently. One of them was a 9-year-old girl in Dusseldorf. Her test answers consistently showed pattern defiance, solving logic problems backward, but arriving at the correct answers. Another was a retired engineer in Frankfurt who reorganized the books in his local library by philosophical influence, rather than by author. Neither had committed a crime, but both were flagged. Their names never reached a courtroom. They reached something else. Inside the Reich's Ministry of Propaganda, a sub-department known as Sonderbarrack 12 was assigned a peculiar task: analyze radio listener behaviors, not content preferences. Pause behavior. The team monitored when citizens adjusted the dial, when they hesitated, when they lowered the volume during certain speeches, only to raise it during music. These fluctuations were logged, then cross-referenced with employment records, then plotted on city maps. The result was something unheard of: a dissent heat map, not of protests, but of potential. Entire city blocks were colored in dark tones, not because anyone acted, but because someone might. That data was forwarded to the house with no shadows. There, it was converted into lists, not of names, but of streets. Entire neighborhoods became suspect, not from what they said, but from the moments they went quiet. In a small Bavarian town called Waltenhofen, a peculiar thing happened. Over the course of 7 months, 6 school teachers were reassigned, 3 bakers disappeared, and 2 booksellers closed their shops without explanation. No violence. No headlines. Just absence. When a local pastor tried to raise concern during his sermon, he found his microphone had been disconnected. When he asked who had done it, the choir refused to look at him. A week later, he left on a pilgrimage and never returned. Waltenhofen was never mentioned again in ministry broadcasts. Not because it was guilty, but because it had been preemptively quieted. What is the name for fear that has no cause? What do you call terror when there is no enemy? The Third Reich had an answer. They called it security. The list was not simply a list. It was a belief system, a religion of risk management. An altar where freedom was sacrificed not for control, but for the illusion of foresight. It birthed a nation where your greatest danger was not your action, but your potential. And in that logic, no one was safe, because everyone has the capacity to resist, even if they never will, even if they never intend to. And so the machine expanded. By 1944, rumors began to surface, faint, untraceable, like the murmur of ghosts of a second list. This one different. Not enemies. Not rebels. But questioners, people who noticed the gaps. People who sensed the design. They were not loud, but they were looking too closely, and that was enough, because in a system built on psychological shadows, even awareness was a threat. After the war, Allied forces found fragments, pages, diagrams, notes with arrows and circles and looping lines that looked more like psychological weather reports than surveillance logs. In one document recovered from the ruins of the RSHA, a margin note read, "He asks a few questions for someone who thinks too much," no name attached, but someone was watching him. Historians never found the list. No single scroll. No central archive. But the absences are real. Tens of thousands of disappearances, unexplained. Reassignments, sudden deaths labeled as illness. Suicide notes written in typewriters, unsigned. Sometimes folded and left on trains that never stopped. And every one of them shares the same fingerprint. They were almost dangerous. And that was all it took. The most disturbing thing about the list is not that it targeted thinkers. It is that it targeted the potential to think. A man could be executed not for shouting, but for hesitating too long before agreeing. A woman could vanish for walking a different route to work, not because it was rebellious, but because it was unpatterned. What Hitler weaponized was not just the state. He weaponized the unspoken. He created a regime where psychology itself was suspect, where to be unpredictable, even innocently, was to be a liability. Where curiosity became a crime. And then the war ended. The files burned. The witnesses silenced. The house with no shadows collapsed into rubble. But rubble cannot bury the kind of horror that never needed a bullet. Because what the list taught, and what modern states learned, is that you do not need to punish ideas when you can prevent their birth. That is the true terror, not censorship, but pre-censorship, not killing the voice, but never letting it form.
You are not looking at a battlefield. You are not walking past trenches or camps or graves. You are looking at absence of thought, of deviation, of hesitation, of dissent. It does not wear a uniform. It does not march. It observes. It waits. And when you speak, it has already written your file. The list may not have existed on paper, but its blueprint still lives, in systems that predict, in codes that flag, in algorithms that decide long before you do. So ask yourself, how would you be measured? Not by what you have done, but by what they think you might do. In a world where patterns are everything, would your silence be safety, or your silence be a signal? Because the most dangerous list is the one you are never told you are on.